Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome back after a bit of a break. So our topic was Ben Yisrael Amim, the relationship or theological perspective we have towards others. And the part of the confusion around the title is we're actually referring to lots of different things. So it can be a question of other faiths, our relationships, other faiths. It's the concept of B'nai Noach and Noachide laws. And then the concept of other peoples in the sense of a Jew and non-Jew. So in many respects, these are all separate hashkafic and halachic domains. I think over the last couple of sessions, we began looking at, I think we started off with defining what we mean, what it means to be a Jew. Not in the halachic sense, in which the answer is relatively clear, a child of a Jewish mother, but what it means to be a Jew. What do we mean when we say we're Jew? We discussed the concept of a covenantal relationship with Hashem, and then we brought out from that that in fact all human beings have a covenantal relationship with Hashem. There's a bris covenant that the Bnei Noach, the Noachites have with Hashem, and before that Adam Harishon was Nolad Mahul. He was born into covenant. But what we mean is a particular type of covenant, or a unique closeness of covenant. I think we then began discussing mitzvahs b'nei Noach and the concept of a ger toshov, someone who's accepted upon themselves the Noachide commandments. And I think we also had a brief aside in which we looked at Amalek and Canaan, the peoples of Canaan. So I just really want to, in today's discussion, re-look at the Sheva mitzvahs b'nei Noach. Again, just a brief tour of them, and then this will be important because one particular class of the Sheva mitzvahs b'nei Noach is that of avodah zarah, and I'll try and look at the view of the poskim around other faiths and whether they are or are not avodah zarah, pagan worship, and how that might affect from a halachic perspective our relationship to other groups. So just a brief reminder, there are Sheva mitzvahs b'nei Noach, and by the time one really fleshes them out, they include a great chunk of the 613 mitzvahs. Even though we talk about there being 7 Noachide mitzvahs, in truth, each one in our listing is many. So for example, one of the Sheva mitzvahs b'nei Noach is arayot, forbidden relationships. And that's just counted as one of the 7. But when we actually look at the list in the way it's listed amongst the 613 commandments, this is many tens of prohibitions. It's incest, and it's with a whole list of different relatives. It's adultery, and so on and so forth. So these count as many mitzvahs. Similarly, when it comes, another one of the Sheva mitzvahs in is dinim, a rule of law. Now, this is separate to that of gezel, that of theft. It's its own category. Gezel, theft, includes many subcategories in halacha. For example, if we look in the Torah mitzvahs, in the 613 commandments, there's gezela and geneva. For some reason or other, it's a separate discussion. The Torah categorizes burglary as different to mugging. So if you directly, forcefully take something from someone, there's one category of theft, that's gezel. And if you slip into someone's house or pickpocket them, there's a second category of theft, that's geneva. So again, the category of theft in the Sheva mitzvahs now includes several subcategories. And then dinim, the system of rule of law, is a vast category. I mean, most of mishpatim, of the Seder of mishpatim, and most of the Seder of shoftim falls into that category. So the non-Jewish world is obligated to set up a legal structure. That's a vast task. And a court system to rule on this legal structure. That's another vast task. And then a police system to enforce it. So the whole sort of functioning of society is categorized as one of the Sheva mitzvahs b'nei Noach, which is dinim. And there's halachic literature and much to ponder as to exactly what that obligation is. Is this a communal obligation or an individual obligation? If I'm an individual non-Jew and I live in a country that doesn't bother with a rule of law and is just ruled by the whim of a monarch with no system of justice whatsoever, am I obligated to rebel and set up my own system of justice, or is this a societal obligation? What degree of oversight and enforcement of this am I meant to have as an individual non-Jewish citizen? So these things are extensive discussions. how sophisticated does this system need to be? Does it just have to include broad categories of theft and murder and the like, which actually probably most societies have, even very primitive or basic cultures, going to have some system of law? Or does it need to be of equivalent sophistication to halacha? Does it need to include things about fraud and overcharging and undercharging? And to what degree is it meant to be a sophisticated system? Does it have to include all the other Sheva mitzvahs b'nei Noach? The Rambam is of the view that it has to include all the other Sheva mitzvahs b'nei Noach. So in that case, many societies are not in fulfilling their obligations to have a system of dinim. Even if they set up a justice system for basic functioning of society, but they're certainly not enforcing avim in hachai, right? There's no courts don't decree that you can't say avim in hachai. So maybe that's in breach of the rule of dinim. And then you have what's a minority opinion, but a significant one, the view of the Ramah and others, that the dinim system, the legal system that the non-Jewish world has to set up, has to be in line with Torah. So he is of the view that the legal system has to be a Torah standards of justice. So our legal system, for example, says you need 2 edim with a very strict standard of interrogation and a high threshold to cross for ne'emonos, for believability. Other legal systems choose to set the threshold higher or lower. I mean, that's a sort of basic function of a legal system. Is that within the flexibility granted to a non-Jewish court? Sorry. Yeah. So it's a separate topic, which I think we touched on when we spoke about gender and male-female in the Torah. It's not that simple. The area of women as edim is not as black and white as it's often presented. There are standards of evidence that certainly in which women are relied upon in monetary matters. So it's a slightly more complicated halachic matter. Yes. Yeah, I think so. I mean, his view seems to be that it needs to be a based-in type system that's set up. Yeah, which is a remarkable view. I mean, it's not generally held, but that's it. I mean, the Ramah is obviously a very senior halachic figure, and that's his view. I mean, and then you obviously have other areas like shochad, bribery, which clearly is in breach of dinim, and I'm simply trying to say that what we call one of the Sheva mitzvahs in Noach, dinim, includes a vast array of prohibitions. Murder, ritzicha, and injury, one of the Sheva mitzvahs in Noach. Again, halachic discussion around how far that goes. The thresholds, I'm not going to go into the debate around this issue, but clearly you need to define in any legal system the start of life and the ends of life, which, to put differently, affects the ways that one would deal with abortion at the beginning of life, and the way one would deal with euthanasia or switching off machines at the ends of life. And there's extensive halachic literature, which has been discussed on other occasions, around how we define the end of life. At the moment now, a lot of talk around how we define the beginning of life because of the recent passage of various laws in America, or the Supreme Court ruling more accurately in America. Or is the non-Jewish world obligated to accept our definition of life? Or is that something that's within their legal remit to define? So again, a little unclear. And so on and so forth. I'm not going to touch on Avodah Zarah too much, because we're going to talk about it in a few moments when we look at Christianity and Islam. But again, Avodah Zarah in the Torah consists of many, many prohibitions. And again, it is legitimate to ask how many of these prohibitions apply to the non-Jewish world. So worship, pagan worship of the sun is clearly Avodah Zarah. That's not controversial. But in the Aseret HaDibros is also that of making graven images. Am I allowed to make a graven image? Is a non-Jew allowed to make a graven image, maybe without intention to worship, or with intention for someone else to worship? Is that included in the prohibition of Avodah Zarah? So I simply want to say that there's an extensive halachic literature as to what the boundaries of the Sheva mitzvahs b'nei Noach are, and these are relevant both for a Noachide who wishes to keep halacha, and for us as Jews because of the prohibition of lifnei iver lo sitin mishol. And I mentioned this in the last year. We are not allowed to put a stumbling block in front of the blind, which Chazal understand to mean not just a literal stumbling block in front of a blind person, but also causing someone else to sin. And this is not a unique responsibility to Jews. It's not just that I can't cause a Jew to sin, I also can't cause a non-Jew to sin. So I think I mentioned the story of the PA who was asked by her boss to bring something to the temple for worship and so on. So these are very, very serious questions. These are, by the way, practical halachic questions asked. I mentioned an exotic scenario in which I spoke about this PA asked to bring idols to the temple, but these are practical halachic questions, in particular asked by doctors. So doctors who are called upon to perform abortions, doctors who are called upon to perform end-of-life care, have real, live halachic questions around lifnei iver and the things they are allowed to do and the things they are allowed to facilitate others doing. So most from doctors would avoid directly doing things which are prohibited for us to do. If in our halachic definition this would be considered prohibited, but facilitating and enabling can get you into the realm of lifnei iver. So for example, if as a doctor one needs to sign off permission for a machine to be unplugged, even if the doctor themselves is not going to unplug the machine, would this then be a problem of lifnei iver because they are facilitating, enabling, which may not be able to happen without them if they are the doctor on duty, the nurse removing or another doctor, junior doctor, removing the machinery. And I'm not going to get into the full issue of when this is or isn't allowed, but does the doctor have to ask the shaila? Do they need to look with a halachic lens at this? These are very, very serious issues.
What may be a very clever picture.
Yeah.
If you read Parshas Noach, it's very difficult to discern what the Shevet is.
Yes.
So that's all dependent on Torah. But a non-Jew is not allowed to learn Torah. So how can he know what the laws is supposed to do?
Okay, so it's a good question. It's a worthy question. The answer is a non-Jew is allowed to learn anything that's relevant to them. So we're not allowed to teach things which are of complete irrelevance, but probably 50% of the Torah and certainly much of the discussion in Halacha around and this is really the point I'm trying to bring out, that the Shevet Mitzvot in Noach is a very, very extensive system. It's not just a basic system of 7 rules. That's all that has to be kept. There's debate around exactly how it expands, as I try to bring out, but it's a significant part of Torah. Moral and ethical learning is included in that. Non-Jews obviously, as are Jews, are expected to develop ethical behavior, moral behavior. So there's plenty of Torah that can be learned. Okay, so this is a summary of the Shevet Mitzvahs B'nai Noach. Since you mentioned this, I'll just say there are other sort of things floating around beyond the Shevet Mitzvahs B'nai Noach. Even they are not an exhaustive category of everything that's involved. As you said, we're not meant to teach areas of Torah that are irrelevant to the non-Jewish world. Non-Jews are not allowed to keep Shabbos, as is well known. And the Rambam, in fact, has a very interesting take on the prohibition of a non-Jew to keep Shabbos. The Rambam says as follows. I just printed this. This is the Rambam in Hilchos Melachim, Perek Yud Halacha Tes. The Rambam says, the Rambam says, Akum she'asak b'Torah chayav misa. A non-Jew is not allowed to engage in Talmud Torah. He uses the phrase of chayav misa, but this does not mean that in practice there is any penalty carried out, and that's not latter-day apologetics. Rambam makes it very clear. There's no practical penalty. It means it's a breach of the sort of relationship a non-Jew is meant to have with the world. Lo yasek elo b'sheva mitzvah shalom bilvad. They should only engage in the Shevet Mitzvahs. This answers your question. They are allowed to learn the Torah of the Shevet Mitzvahs. V'chein akum sheshovas afilu b'yoyim mimos hachol. A non-Jew should not rest even on a weekday. So, for example, declaring Sunday as a Sabbath. And he says that the reason is, even more so, they are not allowed to make festivals. So this is a typical Rambam or Maimonidean reading of a halacha. He doesn't just leave this as a rule that a non-Jew is not allowed to make their own Shabbos or their own festival. He says the point is you're not allowed to be mechadesh dat. You're not allowed to invent your own faith. In other words, the Rambam is of the view that the non-Jewish world should not be creating alternative faiths. They are not obligated to become Jews, but if they want a spiritual pathway, the spiritual pathway is there. That's Shevet Mitzvahs B'nai Noach and recognition of Hashem. Don't create a new ritual framework with its own faith system. That's what this prohibition means. Now, first of all, this is just a very beautiful reading of this halacha. Why is there this rule that you can't keep Shabbos? Says the Rambam, the point is, it's actually not about Shabbos. It can also be a festival. It can be other things also. Don't create your own faith with its own ritual structure. Point number one. Point number two, there is a kula, a leniency in the view of the Rambam, which many of the posts can understand to be the view of the Rambam, which is that a ger, a candidate for gerus, someone in the conversion process, then would be allowed to keep Shabbos. Because this isn't just a blanket rule, don't keep Shabbos. There's a logic to it, which is don't create your own faith. But if this individual is not attempting to create their own faith, they're simply embarking on a journey to gerus, and in the process, they need to practice for a time living a Jewish life, then this would be allowed. This would not be included in this prohibition, because this is not a creation of a la'atzman of creating its own faith. It's a general sort of journey towards actually integrating into Judaism, and therefore wouldn't be included in this prohibition. Sorry. Yes, that is what the Rambam is saying. Yeah, yes, that is the view of the Rambam, that they should not create their own faith. If they're looking for a faith, then either join Klal Yisrael or the system that's designed for spiritual seekers beyond Klal Yisrael, which is the 7 Noachide commandments. But to create a sort of ritual and architecture, structure of faith, that's not allowed. That's the view of the Rambam. Chayv does not mean that one can't engage. Yeah, that doesn't mean one can't engage. We're going to see soon the rules of engagement. That's going to be our next topic now. So what are the rules of engagement? So again, I just want to summarize. It's important when we talk about this topic to distinguish between individuals, people, approach to people, and theological issues of faith and other faiths. In a few moments, we're going to look at the serious issues of potential avodah zarah, pagan worship within Christianity, for example. And again, each one of these is its own topic. I was asked to do this series of Ben Yisrael Amim, of our relationship to the broader world. But as I began thinking about the series, as I said, it became apparent to me that there's about 15 different sugyas here. This isn't one halachic or hashkafic discussion. There's many separate halachic discussions over here. Now, either way, the Rambam is of the view that rather than just seeing this as a specific prohibition against keeping our Shabbos, the correct way to look at this is to see it as founding of another faith. Don't create your own faith. Don't create a Sunday as a Sabbath, a mock Sabbath. That's a chilul Hashem. That's a mockery of the structure of Judaism.
Talking about his own day, or backdating it, and that he must have. The Rambam certainly did. He recognised Islam. He recognised Christianity. That's right. He addressed them both.
He addressed both, and in a few moments we're going to see. So in a few moments we're going to see how he addresses them. Again, there's no contradiction between these topics, meaning you can say on the one hand that Islam is pure monotheism, and as such, we don't have to relate to Muslims as pagan worshippers. They're not, they're worshipping one God. And you can have, in that respect, a very lenient view of Islam in that sense. And in another respect, you can also recognize that it contains the Rambam is, for example, the view of the Rambam is very clear that Muslim belief is heretical. The fact that it's not pagan doesn't mean it's not heretical. The Rambam lists, of all figures, the Rambam lists 13 principles of faith, many of which involve commitment to the Torah and the immutability of the Torah and the accuracy of our Torah. And Muslim belief believes in a prophecy that contradicts many of the tenets of the Torah. The idea that Muhammad was a prophet, receives holy texts from the angel Gabriel, and also includes, maybe this is a slightly later development in Islam, the idea that we corrupted the text of the Torah. In fact, many think that the reason why the Rambam emphasizes so much the immutability of the Torah and the incorruptibility of the Torah, the fact that the accuracy of our Torah text is because of in response to Islam around. So, and this is the point I'm saying, that you will hear people say again and again, which is entirely accurate, the view of the Rambam that Muslims are fellow travelers with us, of worshippers of one God. And in that sense, there's a lot of commonality. But there's another half to it. There's multiple layers to it. Rambam would have had concerns about the invention of another faith, and he also would have had concerns around the heresy towards it. So these things are not they're not all or nothing. There's multiple strands that you need to engage with when you're looking at them. No, then there's no. Yeah.
Just shows the extent of prohibition. But it's, I mean, I'm really been asked this now.
Yeah.
Apart from about to reference,
Yeah.
there's been no attempt to actually teach. How are they supposed to know this?
I don't know. I don't know, and I suspect that. Again, in a previous series, I spoke about Tinuk Shanishba. You know, I don't think the Rambam would have necessarily a harsher judgment than that. This is not. This is not about labeling any one particular. God forbid, chas v'shalom. This is not about labeling any particular individual as a bad person. There's a difference between halachic structure of how halacha defines a practice or a view, and translating that into the real human being standing in front of you on the ground. Real human being standing in front of you on the ground, as you say, we haven't gone out to teach, to proselytize and to missionize and so on. A broader discussion, why not? But some of it is simply about our inability to do certain colours, and some of it is about limited resources and lack of energy, and some of it is about skepticism about whether our message would be well received. Again, I want to emphasise, we learned through the Yud Gimel Ikra. In that case, I did it in another order. I first started off by explaining how a heretical view doesn't mean that an individual is a heretic, and we spoke about ideas of Tinuk Shanishba, the idea that we're not judging any individual in their own particular life experiences. We leave that up to Hashem to work out how responsible or culpable people are. So here I should have also given that introduction. I'm not taking a halachic status of or categorization of belief and translating that into individual responsibility. That's not for us to do. But the belief in and of in itself, the Rambam says, or the action in and of in itself is in the Rambam's view, is a breach of something very fundamental.
So when he's talking about daily rest, create your own daily rest, is he talking about the concept or all the halakhic point, the halakhic from the Jews? Because otherwise, what about secular daily rest and just having
a day off, bank holiday? Yeah, yeah. It's not entirely clear. It's a good question. There are many questions around this. For example, what defines? I began by saying that Shem Mitzvahs are complicated. What defines a day? So does a day only mean when it is our definition of a day? In other words, from sunset to nightfall. Therefore, if a day starts from midnight to midnight, from a halachic point of view, unless you live in Helsinki, that's not a halachic day. That's a bit of one day and a bit of another day. So again, how would that be dealt with? There isn't the problem is, and this ties a bit into Charles's question. There's some halachic discussion around these points, but it's not extensively discussed by the poskim, probably because it was irrelevant for Jews for millennia. There was no long queue of non-Jews lining up saying, "Can we research in detail the parameters of the Shem Mitzvah?" Yeah, no, that's not a criticism. Why should they? Why should they?
People now, there are many Christians who are starting to look at the when they've seen the art scrolls and things coming up, and they've started questioning, and they do question their own faith because of this problem.
There is a growing phenomena. I'll stop the recording just for a few moments because I'm talking about something personal over here. I'll just pause it. So I myself have there is in America, this is a very large movement of very strong Christian supporters of Israel. In the UK, this is small, and through a series of events, I came in contact with a Christian family. We'll go back live anyway. So those are just personal, just some personal anecdotes and so on. So interesting applications. So look, from a halachic point of view, what is the halachic status of other faiths? So I mean, the two faiths that have been dealt with most extensively in halachic literature for obvious reasons are Christianity and Islam. I'll start with Islam because it's the easier one. So the Rambam, who knew Islam up close, of all the Rishonim, he knew it the closest, is very definite that Islam is not Avodah Zarah, it's a monotheistic faith. They are praying to the same God as us. Those who questioned the monotheism of Islam did so because of various rituals that take place in Islam, which do have pagan influences on them. I think there's the stone throwing ceremony and various marches around Mecca and so on and so forth. So there were those who looked at those and said, look, there's pagan worship going on. But those who knew Islam up close, such as the Rambam, didn't believe this was the case. Islam is very, very strongly monotheist. Except they have certain practices that have crept in, that have pagan origins. But the truth is, many faiths have that. That doesn't, including our own, perhaps here and there a little bit, doesn't make it into a chas v'shalom, into a pagan faith. It simply means that individuals are influenced by surrounding cultures. And, what's the origin of the red string? Does it have a genuine Jewish origin? Was it something picked up by various superstitions around? Again, this is a matter of debate for historians, but this is not chas v'shalom something central to Yiddishkeit, to Judaism, to anything of halachic input. It's a practice that some people have, that they believe a red string removes an ayin hara. Is it correct? And I spoke once about ayin hara, I think, and superstition in the shul. There are poskim who are very seriously opposed to it because they see this as something of pagan origins, and there's some evidence for it. There's a Tosefta that ascribes it to pagan origins. So this is not chas v'shalom a flaw in our faith. It's simply areas where people have adopted mistakenly superstitions that maybe don't come from authentic sources, or maybe they do, not commenting on any particular practice. So maybe there are things that crept into Islam that have adaptations of pagan practice, but the Rambam is very clear that they are not pagans, they are not Avodah Zarah, and in that sense, Islam is fairly easy to deal with. One of my teachers, Ramosha Shapiro, used to quote from Rabbi Shua Leib Diskin, who was originally the Rav of Brisk and then moved to Yerushalayim. We're talking back in the days of the old Yeshuv. And he is quoted by the elders of Jerusalem, by the Ziknei Yerushalayim, as paskening that one should not walk within Daled Amos of an Arab, or we would say Muslim, but in the context of Yerushalayim, an Arab, who's praying. Because the halacha is that someone who's praying to Hashem, you're not meant to walk within Daled Amos, within 6 foot, or however you measure an Amah, in front of them. And he said, look, an Arab who's engaged in prayer in Israel, in Jerusalem at the time, is engaged in prayer to the same God as us, and therefore one shouldn't walk within Daled Amos of such a person. So this is just an interesting psak. Non-Jews have tefillah, they have the ability to daven to Hashem. The pasuk says, Ki beisi beis tefillah hilachol amim. My house, referring to the Beis Hamikdash, the temple, is a house of prayer for all people. So all peoples can pray, should pray, and therefore a Muslim who's engaged in prayer is engaged in davening to the same Hashem as us, and therefore this was Rabbi Shua Leib Psak, Rabbi Shua Leib Diskin. Rabbi Shua Leib Diskin, by the way, was a very, very prominent Posek, very, very senior Posek. I have to say it's a difficult Psak, and the reason it's a difficult Psak is because the rule of walking within Daled Amos of someone praying is only the Amidah. You're allowed to walk in Daled Amos of someone saying Bechas HaShacha. Now the Chiddush, the innovation of his ruling, is not that this is an act of prayer. That is, it's nice to hear a God of Israel, a posek, telling us such a psak, but for some reason or other, he seems to be saying it also has the chumrah of Amidah. Now that's the chiddush. That's not obvious at all. Who says this has the status of the Amidah, the silent prayer that we do? But either way, I unfortunately never had the chance to ask Ramesh Shapiro this question. But either way, that was the psak that he gave. So whether you apply it in practical halacha or not, whether you consider it to have the status of Amidah or not, it's a different question. So we should be careful if we see our Muslim brothers and sisters who are engaged in prayer to one God, we should be careful to treat that with respect and realize that this is monotheistic prayer. So that's Islam. To what degree does this translate into access to a mosque? Is one allowed to go into a mosque? So Rabbi Ovadia Yosef in a tshuva drew the conclusion from this that one is allowed. There's no concerns with going into a mosque, and that was his psak. Others disagreed, and this really gets back to our previous discussion. They said this is true that this is a place of monotheistic worship, but it's also a place of broadcasting heretical views. At the end of the day, Islam promotes a message of the inaccuracy of our Torah and a message of latter-day prophecy, which includes things which are certainly not in line with our beliefs. It doesn't believe in our obligation to keep Torah and mitzvahs, and therefore this is a place of heresy, albeit not a place of pagan worship. It also may be a place of Avodah Zarah. Avodah Zarah can be translated as idol worship, which it certainly is not. A mosque is not a place of idol worship, but it is a place of avodah zarah, of foreign worship, in the sense of foreign practice of worship which is not in line with our own views of how to worship.
What is the reason
Worship
for
Hashem.
non-entry? What would be the reason for non-entry? Because we may leave it, because we're giving straight to it, because
Excellent. So we'll look at that in more detail when we get to the debate around the church. But all else being equal, to go into a place of heresy is clearly not a good Jewish idea. Why not? Maybe it's indicative of belief. Maybe it has an influence on one. Maybe it's seen as some level of agreement. So, however one categorizes it, all else being equal, if there's no particular reason to do so, why go to a place of heretical broadcast? Now, what exactly is the nature of the prohibition will then affect how you deal with it if you do need to go into it. So here we're just talking about casual visiting for no particular reason. Why go into a place of heresy? So argue the postscript who argue on Rabbi Yosef. I'll come to in a second. But what reason would allow one to go in? If it's into faith, or if it's a need to go in, or you're looking for a quiet spot to pray. Right, maybe Rabbi uses that example. He says if you're somewhere where there's nowhere to daven, rather than davening is remarkable teshuvah. He says rather than davening in the street where you'll get distracted and hustle and muscle, you find a quiet corner in a nice shady mosque where again he says maybe this is halacha being very and maybe this isn't on a practical level the wisest thing to do, and maybe there it does indicate problems. But the point simply is that from Rabbi's point of view, in and of in itself, no concerns. The Tzitz Eliezer and various other prominent poskim who also knew Islam up close said this is simply not the case. It's not avodah zarah, pagan worship, but it is foreign worship, and it is a place of worship in a manner which we don't agree with, in a place that recognizes the message of a prophet that we don't accept. That's already a problem. Sorry.
The point of the Rambam, which we learned earlier on.
Yeah.
How does he square the circle when he knows that they've taken the text and substituted Yishmael for Yitzchak? And a creation of a new faith. He seems on one hand to allow it because of monotheistic, on the second, but he seems to sort of shy away from full-blown avodah zarah because they've literally created a new faith. He seems to have accepted it as a halfway house.
Exactly, and again, I repeat what I said. There is no one halachic question here. There's 3 or 4 halachic questions. Is it avodah zarah? No, it's not. Is it heretical? According to the Rambam, absolutely yes. It's in breach of many of the 13 principles of faith. Is it in creation of another faith, which, creation of faith? Who knows? It depends on some of these details we discussed about what exact level of ritual is a problem with that. So you can't just ask one single. This is the frustration when one deals with the topic, and there's a reason I'm emphasizing this, because so much of the discussion around this is superficial, because we want to have all or nothing. Either it's it's a yes or it's not, and there's a nuance to this. There's shades of perspective over here. We're going to see Christianity, which has very serious pagan elements to it in our thinking, about Christianity, which the Rambam thought was avodah zarah. Even there, the Rambam has some positive things to say. It's not going to be black and white. We don't have to have something that's all good or all bad. And in a sense, that's where I want to get to over this. And I was asked to speak about some of Rabbi Sachs's comments around this, and I will. We're not going to shy away from this. We will look at some of the stuff he said. But from now on, I'm not even dealing with it on a hashkafic perspective. I'm just trying to deal with it from a halachic perspective and say that here we have 2 very prominent poskim who take a different stance around the okayness of just casual entry, but from a halachic point of view, this is simple to say, which is it's not avodah zarah according to mainstream opinion, and it does have elements of pagan practice and ritual and superstition that crept into it. Point number 2, and point number 3 is certainly the message of the falsehood of the Torah and the substitution that took place are very, very profoundly problematic from a Jewish point of view. By the way, the Tzitz Eliezer also raises questions, very interesting questions, around the relationship that they have to Muhammad. And this really raises questions about at what point does ascribing spiritual potency to someone shift into problematic territory? So if you just say he was a prophet, clearly we would disagree with that, in the sense that the message that we have of his prophecy seems completely out of line with the message of the Torah. But when you have a very, very strong ethic, and he speaks about this, of, for example, the prohibition against drawing any imagery of him. So what mindset of holiness is this, that would say that you're not allowed to draw an image. I'm not talking about a mocking image, a cartoon or the like. By the way, no Jew should engage in that practice. We shouldn't. Why should we hurt people's feelings and mock and so on? But let's maybe or something, but not this case over here. So, but let's say a respectful image. If I'm trying to write a book of history and I decide to put an image in, so the Muslim world has a serious problem with that. So there's also questions there. He says that there's elements within it which I think are ascribing over sanctity and godlike sanctity. If we say the only being of whom one isn't allowed to draw an image is Hashem, and you have a faith which is saying don't draw an image of a human being, maybe that itself edges towards problematic territory. So this is the view of the Tzitz Eliezer Rabbi a very prominent posik again, but certainly paganism, Avodah Zarah, no, it isn't. Sorry, you wanted to. In general, the Sephardi poskim do not treat Islam as paganism. Yeah, those who knew it up closest in general didn't, and we have to be very careful when we're talking about poskim and psokim that to what degree they knew up close the phenomena they were talking about. So I want to be quite conscious of that. But certainly Rabbi Vadia had the confidence to say that those who ascribed paganism to Islam misunderstood what it was, and what they saw was aspects of pagan practice that had crept into the faith, but not that the faith itself was pagan. That was his view. So yeah.
Sinai, you don't really theoretically have a problem with somebody giving prophecy, do you? There were enough prophets.
If a non-Jewish group would claim that a prophet appeared to them who taught them belief in Hashem, which Muhammad did, and ethical and moral behavior, and Musa, work on yourselves, grow spiritually, in and of in itself, that would not have heresy. It wouldn't be pagan, it wouldn't be Avodah Zarah. We wouldn't in and of in itself have a fundamental problem with that. We may question, do we believe or disbelieve the claims of prophecy? That's an interesting question, particularly since our understanding is that prophecy has ceased. But that's not in breach of any principle of faith. There's no ikka there. There'll be a question of, is this a novi sheker, right? Is this a false prophet or not? So we're in a few weeks' time, we're going to head towards the parshas of Dvorim, which discuss the phenomena of a novi sheker. So broadly speaking, there are two types of novi sheker. There is a novi sheker who prophesizes something against Torah, either promoting Avodah Zarah or promoting the permanent cancellation of mitzvahs. And Muhammad would fall foul of the latter category. That's category number one of novi sheker. Category number, the permanent cessation of mitzvahs, the rewriting of the Torah of Moshe. So there's two types of false prophet. Category number one of false prophet is a false prophet who promotes something against Torah, which means one of two things. One is even a temporary cessation of the prohibition of Avodah Zarah, and the second is the permanent cessation of any mitzvah in the Torah. So, for example, Eliyahu on Har HaKarmel allowed a temporary suspension of a mitzvah. He said we can do this experiment with the Nevi'ei Habal, in which we offer sacrifices to Hashem outside the Beis Hamikdash, and that's forbidden, that's asa. Nonetheless, he was entitled as Novi to temporarily suspend Torah. However, permanent rewriting of the Torah, as is ascribed, again, it's difficult to know exactly what Muhammad or the founder of Christianity said, but as is ascribed to them, that would fall foul of that category of false prophet. A second category of false prophet is one who's promoting a perfectly good and innocent message. Nothing wrong with it, giving Musa, 10 people, do teshuvah, otherwise the Beis Hamikdash will be destroyed or whatever it may be. But in the process of so doing, gives prediction, claims predictive ability, predicts a positive event which then doesn't occur. So this is a second category of false prophecy. However, if someone claims to be a prophet, gives legitimate Torah messages that are in line with our values, doesn't make predictions, they wouldn't fall into either category of false prophet. You and I may have our own personal views around whether they are reliable prophets or not. That's our business to decide. But there's no fundamental heresy in this. There's not something which is kafira in any way at all. So if a prophet would emerge that would stick to that message, As Jews, we would say, you know, we're not going to engage with it particularly, but I don't think we would have any obligation to particularly fight it or be concerned about it. We would simply question it, but there's no breach of any of the Yud Gimel Ikrim. The problem is that at least again, we don't really know much about the historic figures of Muhammad or the founder of Christianity. We don't know. By the way, I refer to him as the founder of Christianity, certainly here in a shul, and it's a halachic discussion about elsewhere, because there are claims of God status ascribed to him, in which case this may be the name of an avodah zarah. I discussed on a Friday night this as from a halachic matter, and I don't think there's a technical breach of halacha, but nonetheless, in common speech, I prefer to refer to that. Because Muhammad is simply a claim of a prophet, and therefore we don't have a problem saying his name. But we don't know much about the historic figures of either of them by definition. I mean, what we have is second and third hand. But if their claim was more than just teaching Musa and growth and spirituality, then we would assume there's a status of a false prophet. Yeah, sorry, you have another book now. Okay, so this is Islam. Just to summarize, Islam is by and large broad consensus is that it is not avodah zarah, it's not pagan worship. It may have heretical elements to it. There may be other serious problems with it, but not heresy. We've run out of time for today. But next week, please God, we'll look at Christianity, and I'll briefly touch on Buddhism and Hinduism and some of these other faiths. And then either next week or the week after that I think is Rezi Tisha B'Av, because I'll try and finish it next week then, because then there'll be a summer break and I'd like to finish it off. I'll try and just touch then a little bit on some of the nuance that the Rambam brought to the conversation, Rabbi Sachs in certain ways brought to the conversation. So I'll just try and touch on some nuance around this. Also, no, there's not seven. There's not seven mitzvahs. No. I don't know if anyone's ever done a count, and a lot of it's caught up in machlokas. But the truth is, as I said, there's at least 100 if you really add up the numbers. Yeah, there's at least 3 figures of mitzvahs b'nei. Yeah. Okay. Yes.
In the debate that took place with Rabbi Jacobowitz and